by all accounts, they outdrew the National League in attendance by perhaps a margin of 2-1. It was funny, as the first and maybe only time in baseball history, every day in the newspapers or every week in the newspapers, they had next to the standings of the Players League or the National League, they had the attendance standings. In other words, which league and which teams were getting the most fans, and people were paying attention to that as much as they were the wins and losses. And by all accounts, the Players League drew so many more fans than the National League because the National League was dealing with a bunch of unknown players.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, what's going on, everybody? How you doing? My name's Tim Hanlon, that is, and I'm your humble and congenial host for another episode of Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast devoted to, of course, what used to be in professional sports. And I'm just delighted that you have come back and put us in your listening devices and in your earbuds or whatever method by which you inhale or engage with this content. We appreciate it. We always look forward to making it for you. And hopefully today's episode is no different in terms of intrigue, interest, and just a plain old curiosity fulfillment. And today it is in the sport of baseball. We're going back to the oldie times of baseball. And yet that said, if you sort of get put off by some of the more historical episodes that we do, I would suggest you not kind of give up too easily on this one. Yes, it's 1890 or so, and we're going back to the earliest days of baseball professionally here in this country. But as we probably have been able to sort of determine or discern thus far in our various journeys over the last year and change, in many respects, a lot of the themes around teams and leagues, et cetera, that are no longer with us, they seem to keep coming back around and around again. And it's the proverbial, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And the Players League of 1890 is a very, how can I best put it, a very representative, I think, example of some of those issues that frankly still exist today. In particular, the issue around the reserve clause, certainly something not just germane only to the sport of baseball, but has been something bedeviling all of pro sports through much of its modern day existences in the 19th, the 20th, and now the 21st centuries. The idea, the notion that players have rights and can be more in control of where their services can be delivered and recompensed. But, that's not necessarily always the case. As new leagues pop up, we've talked about centrally owned leagues trying to keep costs down, moving players or controlling player contracts. You could argue in the many, many decades earlier in baseball's life, the idea that collusion amongst various owners was in the air, so to speak, whether it was unwritten or unspoken. It was certainly very existent. And there have been a whole bunch of things that have occurred in baseball, but also in other sports that have been tumultuous and very disruptive on a number of occasions with strikes and work actions, lockouts, and you name it. The Players League of 1890 was certainly perhaps one of the first significant, shall we call them player revolts or rebellions against the big bad owners and their restrictive ways. And our conversation today is with author Bob Ross. No, not the guy from the old PBS art show, The Joy of Painting, although he would have been a very interesting guest in his own right. Obviously not for sports, but just like, for example, what was going on with that fro of his and his constant cheery attitude. I guess something that was always a curiosity to me when watching him on the old PBS days back in the 70s. But I digress. Bob Ross, today's Bob Ross, the guy who's written a book about the Players League, is a fascinating story. It's called The Great Baseball Revolt, The Rise and Fall of the 1890 Players League. And if you have any interest in sort of how labor exists today, why players get the kind of money they get today, how owners and players have gotten along, or frankly, in many cases, have not gotten along over the many decades and centuries, this is a very intriguing episode for you to listen to, learn from, and enjoy with our guest, Bob Ross, the author of The Great Baseball Revolt, The Rise and Fall of the 1890 Players League. I encourage you to listen and enjoy that in a couple of seconds. A couple of promo items to get out of the way. I want to remind you that sportshistorycollectibles.com is absolutely the best place to find sports memorabilia of all kinds, shapes, and sizes from various teams and leagues that are no longer in existence, and frankly, a bunch of them that are, but perhaps are in different incarnations and whatnot. Give a look over at sportshistorycollectibles.com, and if you find something you really like, and I'm pretty sure you're going to find something of interest that you just might be on the fence about buying, well, here's maybe a way to tip the scales in your favor, and frankly, a little bit in our favor. Use the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout. Why? Well, because you're going to get 15% off your purchases. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. Use that promo code GOODSEATS, and you will get, courtesy of our friend Dean Mitchell and the proprietor of SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, 15% off your purchases. Thank you to Dean. Thank you to SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, and thank you for giving them a try. I think you'll enjoy them, and bookmark them and go back early and often, as they say, and I'm sure you're going to find some stuff, if not now, certainly later, as more inventory and items come available. Again, SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS. And of course, we want you to try an audiobook from Audible. audibletrial.com/goodseats. It is free for 1 month and a free audiobook download. You're going to get that when you use the website, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Audiobooks are awesome. 180,000 titles to choose from. You've heard this before. You can cancel at any time. Let me repeat that. You can cancel at any time. It's no risk. You will risk nothing. Give a listen to an audiobook. Try it out for yourself. Guaranteed you're going to find a book that's interesting to you, and try to, give it a listen and get through it. And I believe once you're about halfway through the process, you're going to realize that it's a wonderful way to catch up on all the reading that you've been meaning to do, but frankly just don't have the time to do, but you can listen to. And that's what audiobooks are about. And Audible is by far the best purveyor of such. And again, audibletrial.com/goodseats is the place to go to give it a try for yourself. And again, get a free month's subscription to the Audible service. And most interestingly and most importantly, a free audiobook download of any of the 180,000 titles to choose from for you to listen to and to enjoy. Thanks for giving them a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. All right, promotional banter is now complete. And now we move on to the fun and exciting part of our conversation with Bob Ross, author of The Great Baseball Revolt, The Rise and the Fall of the 1890 Players League. This is interesting stuff about baseball history coming up. Please enjoy. I'd love to sort of get a sense before we get into sort of the story and the book and all that stuff, your background and or how even this topic of the Players League in 1890 and baseball in general just crossed your radar altogether.
Sure. Well, thanks again for inviting me on to your show. I'm a big fan, and I actually have some requests for teams that I would love to see you cover, but maybe we can talk about that later.
I love it. We take requests. This is awesome. We appreciate that. So I'm happy to have that. But first, you got to give me some quality interview before we get to your request. So
sure. Yeah, sure. Well, I was a graduate student in the Department of Geography at Syracuse University. Let's see, I started there in 2003, and I've been a lifelong baseball fan as long as I can remember. I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan, and recently an adopted National League Pittsburgh Pirates adopted fan. I live in Pittsburgh now, so I enjoy going to those games. But when I was in Syracuse, I was looking for a dissertation topic. I was studying economic geography, historical labor geography, and I went through a bunch of different possibilities. There was a brief time where I thought I was going to write a dissertation about the death industry, looking at funerals and crematories and all kinds of things. And I'm glad I did not stick with that. That would have been very depressing. I thought about looking at the trucking industry. And basically, I wanted to look at an industry from a political economy, geographic perspective. I was studying Marxist geography at the time with a wonderful professor named Don Mitchell. And kind of just I wasn't really able to find anything I liked. And then one day I was at home and I was looking through my old copy of Total Baseball, which I tend to do. And I found one paragraph about the 1890 Players League, this partially player-owned and operated league that lasted just 1 year. I had never heard of it before, and that really piqued my interest. And I Googled what I could. There wasn't a lot written about it, but there was enough to spur some further interest. And I approached my advisor and said, "Well, what do you think if I wrote a dissertation about a 19th century baseball league?" And he kind of looked at me funny and said, "Well, if it's good and it's critical and it's well researched, I don't see a problem with that." So I started researching the Players League, and I honestly enjoyed every minute of it. And I know that that's not most graduate students' experience when they study a topic for a few years. I loved researching it, writing about it, going to the Hall of Fame library in Cooperstown and other archives. So yeah, it was fantastic. And now that the book's been out for almost 2 years now, I still enjoy reading about baseball history. I'm not currently doing any baseball history research, but yeah, baseball is a great joy of mine as a casual fan and also as a researcher.
Well, you wouldn't be the first person to ever have been caught guilty of stealing some time, either to kill off time or avoid other chores or responsibilities in life by dreaming away in the various pages of Total Baseball, for sure. So what did you think about this league? Or what did you know of it before you kind of dove in head first into all of this? What were your impressions? What was your thinking? What was your understanding, I guess, before you got involved? And then maybe take us on the journey as to how you became involved, sort of the process, I guess, to which you unearthed the story, which we'll eventually get to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what interested me first was the apparent, I don't want to say radical nature, because it wasn't radical, but it was it was a labor-oriented league, a self-titled working class league, and that's debatable whether it actually was, but just the fact that it was this league made up of unionized baseball players who wanted to share a greater portion of the value that they were creating. And so as this young graduate student who was interested in Marxist theory and labor politics, it was really exciting that a sport that I've loved my whole life had this long forgotten, buried chapter in its history. So I had that sort of just general notion of the league when I started. I didn't really know what had motivated the players. I honestly hadn't studied 19th century baseball at all. I watched Ken Burns' documentary a long time ago, but I didn't have any expertise in 19th century baseball or even really baseball history beyond just reading what I was interested in. But I started digging into it, and I started looking through old newspapers. I started figuring out where there were archives of primary source material, and I found that most of that stuff was in Cooperstown and also at the New York Public Library in the Albert Spalding collection. And just sort of like followed all the trails from there. I researched it for probably 2 or 3 years before I wrote the dissertation. And then after the dissertation, a few years later, I did a couple more years of research and writing and ended up publishing the book in 2016.
Well, it's interesting. It almost feels like it almost was maybe an advantage of not sort of being a, I guess, saber card carrying baseball researcher / historian, right? I mean, it sounds like you were approaching this obviously from an academic perspective, which is one thing, but more from an economics and labor and union kind of background and concept versus sort of the asterisk in baseball history and the stats and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I hate to put it this way, but I was using the league to try to make some larger academic theoretical points about the relationship between economics and geography and labor and capital and all that sort of thing. But it was great to embark on a research project like that, where I'm also just massively interested as a fan in baseball history. But yeah, I wasn't one of those folks who could like answer trivia questions about the 1887 Cleveland team's backup shortstop, or even their starting shortstop.
But to me, that's especially interesting, right? Because frankly, a lot of the history around this league that you're talking about, or we're going to talk about, and the lead up to it, and frankly, some of the legacy issues, although not necessarily fully understood and or remembered, right, actually are very, very important still today in this day and age when we get to things like the reserve clause. I mean, at the end of the day, right, the National League of the 1880s, right, from which this Players League emanated from, a little bit of the American Association too, but it was really kind of, I think, a tableau, a story about the beginnings of what professionalism, quote unquote, looked like in the sport of baseball, a relatively new idea at the time, and a struggle, I guess, to figure out what a quote unquote business model was going to look like for a sport that was ostensibly, until maybe 1880, really an amateur pursuit, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it went even beyond sports. The theater was becoming really popular then, and not just like high culture theater, but the theater as something to do on a Friday or Saturday night for ordinary folks. And the theater was also struggling with how do we make this profitable while also drawing upon extraordinarily talented workers, namely the actors. And so there was there were parallel developments going on with the theater. And as I wrote about in the book, some of the players were deeply involved in the theater in one way or another, either as sort of part-time actors or, as we'll talk about with John Ward, he was married to one of the most famous actresses at the time. So I think it was this kind of problem or development in sort of the entertainment industry more generally of how can we professionalize this and to some extent mass produce it for large audiences and make money at that. And it was a struggle and to some extent still is today.
Yeah, I mean, and there are numerous examples. Obviously, the arts, the entertainment industry, advertising, a space that I've been in for a whole bunch of years professionally, right? It's sort of this collision, and often inelegant collision between art and commerce. And I guess the art, in this case, right, is a group of talented men, in a sport that had some popularity and was of interest to people to pay for and to watch and to enjoy. And frankly, like a lot of artistic pursuits or entertainment businesses, if you will, or fledgling businesses, right? The economics, right, are clearly part of the mix. If not early on in the earliest days, they certainly make themselves manifest relatively quickly when things get even more popular and people show a propensity to pay for them. And I suspect that maybe is, and we've heard this in some of our previous conversations, some of which you may have heard or not quite yet, around, I hear time and time again, and whether it's a recent, departed league or even in the past, there's one of the themes that keeps echoing is businessmen, mostly men, of course, in this day and age. But looking at this as there's something good here. People are willing to pay and or pay attention to it. What's the business here, and how can I maximize it? And I suspect that was a relatively ragtag and Wild West, so to speak, in the years prior to 1890 when this Players League actually came about.
Yeah, it was, and there was also a tension between folks who wanted to keep baseball in their eyes pure, and by pure they meant mostly an amateur game and an amateur game for gentlemen. That's really where baseball had its origins in America, as this kind of gentleman's sport where different clubs would play one another in the same way that, rich folks go and play golf together today, maybe not super competitively or certainly not because of the money. But as baseball became more popular, as you suggested, people discovered that people would pay to see these players play. And as the players started realizing, hey, they're paying to see us play, not to see my boss send us out on the field, the players in the 1870s, late 1860s and 1870s, really took a lot of control of the sport and would move from one team to another, sometimes month to month. If one team wouldn't pay them enough, they'd go to another team, and that team would give them a higher salary, and then they'd move to another one, and it was really chaotic. And players were the best players were making a good amount of money, but the owners couldn't figure out how they could capture these players and keep them from just jumping from one team to another. And so when the National League emerged in 1876, it soon developed, certainly within the first about 5 years of its existence, as the most successful and really the first successful means by which a group of owners, investors, could make money off of this very popular sport and basically increase revenues without increasing salary.
So let's talk about that, and then we can maybe segue into the aforementioned John Montgomery Ward, who almost in many respects is I would say a microcosm, but almost is emblematic, I guess, of the player plight, I guess, that led up to 1890, which we'll eventually get to. But so maybe you can give our audience a sense of how the owners started to coalesce around how they were approaching talent and the cost economics of talent and these franchises that they increasingly saw as true enterprises, maybe a bit uncharted, but if you can give our audience a sense of sort of how they approached sort of the cost input, so to speak, of these franchises, namely the most expensive part, which is, of course, the players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there were three general strategies that I discussed in the book that they used, and the first was they built these territorial monopolies, and what that meant is that in the league constitution, they said if there's a team in, say, Philadelphia, that team in Philadelphia can play no other team within a certain geographic radius, and what this did basically is it put other teams either out of business who wanted to be in Philadelphia as well, for instance, or it put them kind of in a lesser league where they'd have to compete against other teams that were not in the National League. And so it kind of created these monopolies in different big cities. And there are some exceptions, like Worcester, Massachusetts had a team for a little while mostly based on just friendships between different businessmen who wanted to see their friend in Worcester have a team. So that was the first strategy. The second strategy, something that a lot of owners took advantage of, but none more so than Albert Spalding, and that is they figured out how to mass market this sport while still only having 7 or 8 or 9 teams in 7 or 8 or 9 cities, and that was to sell merchandise and sporting goods especially, and to use the game of baseball that might be played in one particular place at a particular time to sell lots of baseballs and baseball bats and rudimentary gloves to massive audiences. And so Spalding became very rich, not really directly from owning the Chicago National League franchise, but from all his sporting goods that he and his brothers had a worldwide empire of sporting goods, and then that money was filtered back into the league. But the third strategy that really was the most directly relevant to the emergence of the Players League and probably the most powerful one was that the owners of the National League figured out how to keep the players in place, literally. They created what is called the reserve rule, meaning that teams initially would have a select number of players that they reserved on their team that they all of the owners agreed no one else can go after this guy, and this guy. I mean, it's kind of like I'm in a fantasy baseball league, and we are in what's called a keeper league. So people I draft this year, I get to keep next year and forever if I want to. That's sort of how baseball operated in the 1880s and all the way up until the 1970s, with the exception of the Players League, which we'll get into in a moment. But eventually, by the early 1880s, all players on all teams were reserved, meaning that once you were on New York or on Buffalo or Chicago or whatever team, you had no choice but to stay there unless your owner decided to sell you to another team. And then you had no choice but to go to the other city. And so players resented this for 2 reasons. One, they didn't like to be bought and sold. The players used quite explicit language about how they felt like cattle or they felt like slaves. They felt like they were just property that was being shipped around. And 2, they recognized very quickly that without the ability to put teams in competition with one another for their services, their salaries went down. Basically, the league figured out that they could pay the players just as much as possible that it would keep the players in baseball. So, they wouldn't pay them as much as a carpenter would make, for example, because then the players might say, well, to heck with baseball, I'm going to be a carpenter. But they would pay them just enough to stay in baseball, but no more, really. And this was implemented in various ways, and it saw different forms. By the mid-1880s or toward the late 1880s, the National League started grading the players, not just on-field habits, but off-field habits as well. Whether they were a drinker or they were a womanizer or they cursed a lot.
Which is probably which I think is about everybody at that point. Right?
It seemed that way, yeah. And they used those grades then to say, well, therefore you only get $1,500 a year instead of $2,000 a year. So the players, on the one hand, were really fed up with this, but on the other hand, this made baseball extraordinarily profitable. It enabled the National League to put a very fine product on the field in these beautiful ballparks for fans that were flocking in increasing numbers to the games. So you had this contradiction of increasing profitability and increasing resentment and anger among the players.
Yeah, that's very. And I think it's probably also important to remember or to highlight here, based on my research, which is a hell of a lot more crack and amateur than perhaps yours. But the idea that even with this restraining kind of constricture, shall we say, by the owners around the players and sort of keeping them in check and or in line, it was still the profession of baseball, whether you thought it was a noble pursuit professionally or not, which I know was another sort of side issue, was a pretty good remunerative one for those who were qualified and good enough to play, right? Relative to the average worker doing other things and other careers at that time, I think. Yeah,
definitely. And so these players were, I did the calculations when I wrote the book. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, they were making, if you adjusted for inflation, like between maybe $50,000 and $250,000 a year in today's dollars. And actually those figures would probably be a little different because that was a few years ago when I calculated that. So they were not impoverished by any stretch of the imagination. They were doing fine. In some respects, they were wealthy, but not obscenely wealthy like today's athletes. Many of the players had to take second jobs in the off season. And then if they were injured, they would have their pay deducted. So there wasn't much insurance. There certainly wasn't any pension plan. So they had a relatively precarious, yet relatively comfortable existence as players. And they were celebrities to a certain extent. And they weren't. And this is in the midst of the 1880s when there were major labor campaigns going on. People were still working in factories and coal mines and had jobs that were tremendously more difficult and dangerous than playing baseball for a living. But the players still saw themselves as working men. They saw themselves as exploited. They saw themselves as part of a class of workers that was pitted against a class of capitalists, as they saw it in their language. And they thought, just as any other working man deserves as much pay as they can get, and as much value as they create, they do as well. And they also saw that baseball was making a tremendous amount of money, and they thought to themselves, why is it the owners that are keeping this when it is us who are the reason that people come out to see baseball games?
Well, let's segue into Monty Ward, formerly known as John Montgomery Ward, or John Ward, because he's, in many respects, I think, almost a personification of this, shall we say, growing collective angst, perhaps, amongst the players. And he's an interesting cat. We don't need to necessarily go into his statistics and his background, and obviously he's a member of the Hall of Fame and all that kind of stuff. Quite a great player. But he almost, it's very interesting because circa 1885, right, which, as you saw in my notes, I put an exclamation point next to, somewhat of a Renaissance man in that, in the midst of being one of the better players of his day. He's graduating from Columbia Law School. Not an easy sort of feat, I would imagine. But why, so I think that's obviously crucial, though, to the importance of Ward amongst what you just described, and perhaps using that legal education almost as a, dare I say, as an inaugural or initial patron saint of unionization?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good way of putting it. Certainly for the sport of baseball, he was the reason, or the primary reason that a union was created in the first place. And he was such an interesting character. He was universally respected and liked. I mean, you never would read an owner saying a bad word about him, even in the midst of the Players League struggle, when other folks within baseball weren't talking to one another, or they were just every day lambasting one another in the press. But everyone loved John Ward. I can't even think of a contemporary example of someone who would be as equally well respected. He was this gentleman. He was well spoken. He was well educated. he was also a self-made man. He has such an interesting life. He grew up in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, near State College, and he went to Penn State, which was then sort of more of a boarding school, high school, and he was actually kicked out of Penn State for stealing chickens from the neighboring farm. But then he figured out how to get back on his feet, started playing baseball, and once he was in New York playing in the National League for the team that would eventually be called the Giants, he enrolled in Columbia. Why not get a law degree while you're playing professional baseball as one of the best baseball players? And so, he also wrote a book about baseball while he was a player. He often wrote articles in the newspapers and magazines of the day. And, he had just everyone's attention, really. People would listen to what he had to say. They'd read what he wrote. And the players really followed his lead. I don't think I've read anything that any player has ever said negative about him. So he was this perfect leader and perfect ambassador for baseball. And he really threw a curve. That's sort of a cheap pun, but he threw a curve literally and figuratively into the National League in terms of this being a representative of the players against the wishes of the owners. Because if the players hadn't had a leader such as Ward, the National League may have had an easier time saying, well, you're all a bunch of drunks and you're uneducated, you don't know what you're talking about. But because Ward kind of led the players into their first union, which we can talk about, and then into the Players League, it was more difficult for the National League to combat the players' interests, at least in the press, because they had to show respect for Ward. There was no way around it. I guess, I don't know, I'm trying to think of any player recently or currently who has that kind of respect. And I don't know, maybe like Michael Jordan or someone like that.
It's also not just as a player and the respect of managers and fellow players, but obviously it's also that with I guess respect accorded to intelligence and leadership skills and maybe thinking sort of longer term and strategically versus sort of being a champion and or a general on the field, so to speak, in the heat of play and battle. But so, all right, maybe and by the way, you kids out there, if you didn't sort of catch that sort of double entendre there, by many accounts, Ward is credited, although I'm sure it's hotly debated in the Sabre circles, and it's not for me to say. I'm not a Sabre, baseball stats geek. I just play one on television, right? But he's widely credited with either inventing or perfecting or advancing the art of the curveball. So that's literally the part, but figuratively, maybe it's time to sort of get into the lead up to this thing called the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players, which ostensibly, by my understanding, was the mechanism by which Ward, the players, and then ultimately this breakaway league kind of put things in motion, so to speak, to, shall we say, push the issue that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players was the first union in baseball history, and it formed in 1885, initially by the players on the New York Giants. Ward was chief among them. All of the players on the Giants joined this union. It was secret at first, and so they organized other players, often on the ball field. So a runner gets on first base, and the first baseman for New York would talk to the runner about it. They'd go to the saloons after the game and talk about the union. They'd have secret meetings in Cleveland or in Chicago. And little by little, they got most of the players in the National League by 1886 to join this union. When they finally published their existence, when they went public as a union, the National League refused to recognize them. They wouldn't meet with them. But the union really just wanted to be recognized. They wanted to, one of the biggest issues initially was to not be bought or sold. They didn't want a salary cap. They didn't want to be reserved. It was initially at least a relatively modest set of goals. They certainly weren't calling for a brand new league that would be fundamentally different than the National League. They were recognized themselves as ambassadors of the game, and so they had a strict moral conduct code that they asked players to follow, which of course not all of them did, but they were, despite all that, they were really ignored by the National League, and kind of just the National League owners just turned their nose up on them and hoped that they would go away, which they didn't, at least not for a while.
So was there some placation though, or placating of this union by the league members, the league owners, or was it truly a dismissal and/or don't bother us and we don't take you seriously?
Well, as time went on in the 1880s, first there was, I guess you could call it placation. They would agree to meet with them, or they'd say, "Well, it's July. Let's meet in November." And so they'd agree to meet in November. And then by November, the National League owners would have already issued their contracts for the next year. So any meeting with the union would be sort of useless. Or sometimes they'd get a little concession here and there. But basically, the National League was just trying to, if they couldn't get rid of them, just make them irrelevant. And so there was a sense among the players by 1888, 1889 that, and really even as early as 1887, that the National League's not going to take us seriously. Our owners aren't interested in bargaining with us or doing any sort of negotiation. So we're going to have to start perhaps taking things into our own hands.
Well, it seems though, and again, I'm going through sort of, historical points along the the years here. And I, obviously, if I'm incorrect, I'm happy to be corrected. But it almost feels like in 1888 or so, and I know, again, baseball historians will know that the New York Giants of the National League at that time won the not only the National League pennant, but I guess the de facto or the precursor to what is now the World Series, and there's debate about that. But they beat the American Association's St. Louis Browns, their champion. In that sort of, I guess they call it the Dovray Cup, which is actually ironically named after Ward's wife, as hinted at earlier. But it almost feels like that the owners kind of perhaps picked the wrong guy to kind of push the issue, because the Giants, the owners, sold or attempted to sell Mr. Ward to the Washington Nationals. Again, this is coming off of a championship banner season with some great players and Ward among them. So taking that as assumed fact, is there, based on your knowledge, was there a reason why Ward in particular was being sold in the off season? Was it maybe a signal to be sent because of his stirring up, I guess, and the creation or helping create the Brotherhood? Or was this just an example of the overall horse trading that was going on in the league in general?
Those are good questions. I don't know if there's a definitive historical answer to them. Ward was certainly getting mixed signals. The 1888-1889 offseason was very interesting. Albert Spalding decided that he wanted to promote the game of baseball internationally. And so he rounded up a group of players, Ward included, to take a tour, what initially was called the Australian Tour, where they first traveled across the United States together, and then took a boat to Hawaii and then to some Pacific islands and ended up going to Egypt. I think they went to Greece to basically to promote, or ostensibly to promote the game of baseball, but really to promote Spalding Sporting Goods. And Spalding invited Ward and many of the top Brotherhood leaders on this trip. And all along, Spalding is buddy-buddy with Ward. He's saying, we're going to work something out. Things are going to be fine. And at one of their stops, I think it may have been in Egypt, somehow the players got a hold of a newspaper from back in the United States where they learned not just of Ward's impending sale to Washington, but that the National League had instituted this classification scheme that I was talking about earlier, where the players would be graded on their on the field and off the field behavior. They learned that there was going to be a new salary cap on the players, where it would depress many of the players' salary to a maximum of, I think, $2,000 a year. So all of this had happened while the players are literally on the other side of the world, promoting or helping Albert Spalding promote his sporting goods industry. And so Ward is livid, and the players are livid. Ward at least gets off the boat, finds a way to come home, and they begin planning in secret then, not just a strike, although they talked about that possibility in 1889, a player strike, but they started planning for something altogether different, a whole new enterprise that would, they hoped, leave the National League really in the dust.
Yeah, so that was, you sort of answered a bit of my next question was, wouldn't a strike action be the most logical and perhaps most easily achieved activity versus what ultimately Ward wound up working towards, which was actually literally a separate bolt from league in direct competition?
Yeah, so there was a lot of debate among the Brotherhood members of whether to strike. They talked about striking on the 4th of July. The 4th of July was usually the most attended set of games all season. Every team would play a doubleheader, a double admission doubleheader, and crowds would be beyond capacity. And the players talked about possibly striking on the 4th of July, which would have been a huge financial hit to the National League. Certainly would have gotten a message across to the National League. But for reasons in particular that we don't know yet, because we don't know all of the conversations that were going on among the players, they decided, let's not have a strike, let's do something even bigger. And that was to create a whole new league, which turned out to be the Players League.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up is another guest that I'd like to get. And her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss. And of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum. And Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. So it seems to me that 1889, the season of 1889, right, the season before this Players League is launched, would be almost. And I'd love to go deeper. And if the records and or the anecdotes or whatever don't exist, I mean, I hear Hollywood calling. You have to wonder, because just as a point of fact, right, 1889, the Giants and Ward still performing. He came back and played. Right, and they won again. Then they duplicated their efforts from '88. They won the National League title and then that quote unquote World Series title once again. But you gotta wonder what it was like, behind the scenes and or clandestinely, if that's a word, or in a clandestine manner, what Ward and his fellow brotherhood/players and other folks, perhaps helping them through that process, how they were sort of, quote unquote, by day playing baseball and, working for the man, so to speak, yet all the while, obviously in process, trying to figure out what they were going to do and how to achieve it ultimately in the next year of 1890.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And you're right. I wish someone would make a movie about this, because all along, while all of this is happening that you just mentioned, John Ward's celebrity marriage is starting to break apart. He was married to Helen Dovray, one of the more famous actresses at the time. Everyone knew who she was. Everyone knew who he was. This was a true celebrity marriage. And Ward was having an affair with I believe she was about 17 years old, a neighbor of his. And this got out into the press. Dovray left him. Ward got into a fight with another man who was with this young woman. I mean, it was just had all of the elements of Hollywood drama, whilst also he's playing great baseball and organizing a new league to rival the National League. So it was a very exciting, interesting time in baseball and in New York life, especially. Ward was living in New York at the time, and so all this drama is in the New York papers. And
Hollywood, if you're listening, Hollywood, one of the books then you need to option is called The Great Baseball Revolt, The Rise and the Fall of the 1890 Players League, by our guest, Bob Ross. Here it is. We only, I'll take a small percentage or maybe just a credit in the movie, but just get in touch and we'll get you in touch with Bob, because I mean, look, I agree. I mean, you got to think, I mean, given that too, all that other distraction and stuff, but because of his fame, right. And either as part of his marriage or just on his own, it seems to me that, that was a conduit, or an entree into, some folks of wealth and deep pockets to, aid and abet this brotherhood dream, I guess, of what ultimately became another league. No?
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. I mean, Dovray herself, at least while she was still married to Ward, could have been a source of money. She was certainly quite wealthy from her acting, and she donated this what was called the Dovre Cup, which was, I believe, made out of pure silver, a trophy for the National League champions to have. I think it was, she started doing this in 1885 or 86. Ward was connected to not just her, but other folks in the theater, and other players were connected to some folks like Albert Johnson in Cleveland was a wealthy business tycoon, made a lot of money in the railroad industry, and he was a big friend and fan of the players' cause. So, yeah, the players, some of the, particularly the more famous and more successful players, had been rubbing elbows with politicians, with wealthy people in each of their respective cities. So this was certainly gave the players the idea and the reality that, maybe they could start up a whole new league to rival the National League.
Well, indeed, that's what happened, and I guess maybe this is a good next step in the conversation to kind of get us into the months just prior and the beginnings of the 1890 season, when this Players League actually launches. There's eight teams. You got teams in Boston and Brooklyn and New York, the Chicago Pirates, Philadelphia Athletics, the Pittsburgh Burgers, real original name there, the Cleveland Infants, and the Buffalo Bisons. Maybe a little bit of, scene setting for maybe how this league sort of was announced and or what the quality of play was. And it seems like a good hefty portion of the top talent in the National League bolted to bring their services to this brand new spanking Players League in 1890.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so throughout the 1889 season, there were rumors that plans for this league were going to happen, and eventually, by the end of the season, the players just flat out publicized, we are creating this new league called the Players National League of Professional Baseball Clubs, not to be confused with the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. And they announced that it would be partially owned by the players themselves. So the teams would be owned by player stockholders and what they were calling backers or investors. The players would share in the governance of the league. So the, I guess you could call it a board of directors, would be equally represented by players as with these financial investors. And the players would have contracts for a limited amount of time, sometimes 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, not too different to what we have today. And after their contracts expired, they could put themselves on the market and play for another team. And so this was the way the Players League tried to do away with the reserve clause. But also they saw this as a compromise because this was different than the 1870s where players had no contracts at all. They would play 2 weeks with one team and then play with another team if they gave them enough money. And so Ward argued that this actually will bring stability to baseball while also being fair to the players. So they put teams in almost every city where there was a National League club. There was no National League club in Buffalo, but the players wanted a team there, mostly out of respect to a couple players who lived there and didn't want to move. And they also announced that they would have competing schedules. So whenever the National League Pittsburgh team would play, the Players League Pittsburgh team would play. Likewise in Philadelphia and New York. And so basically they left it up to fans to decide which game are you going to see. Are you going to see the National League game or the Players League game? You couldn't go to both, at least not on the same day. And so the biggest challenge initially in the 1889-90 off season was to find enough investors in each city who would pay the initial startup costs of building new ballparks because they had to build brand new, at the time, state-of-the-art ballparks, which were actually quite beautiful and ornate. they had to find just land in these cities where they could build the ballparks in the first place. And most importantly, they had to sign the players and convince the players that they weren't breaking the law to not play for their National League club in 1890, that they could essentially leave that contract and sign a new contract with the Players League. And so both the National League and the Players League went to great lengths to sign players, and it was often this wild goose chase across the country, into the most remote parts of the wilderness at the time to find players. Literally, there was a case where one of the players went out hunting in, I think it was out in California, somewhere near the Bay Area, and you had representatives from the National League and representatives from the Players League looking through the woods to find this player to give him a contract. But eventually the Players League signed the vast majority of National League players to the Players League. So the 1890 season really saw most of the players who had been in the National League in 1889 now in the Players League in 1890. So if you were a fan of the world champion New York Giants in 1889 who had been in the National League, most likely you would be then a fan of the 1890 Players League New York Giants, because it was basically the same team. And that was pretty similar across baseball. The National League lost most of its players.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you also had to wonder what it was like, sort of, I guess, in the marketplace, right, to see these two leagues battling against each other, I guess, in terms of publicity and trying to come to the games. Obviously, the directly competitive. I didn't realize that the Players League, but I can understand it now, right, is to really kind of almost go for the jugular and go directly competitive and say, look, this is your best players are now competing against you, National League. And it's interesting, too, I guess, that Ward, having been part of the two-time champion New York National League Giants, didn't go to the New York Giants of the Players League, but was part of a team in Brooklyn instead, nicknamed or maybe fully named the Ward's Wanderers. Instead, I'm curious as to why that was the case, but I don't know if you know the answer to that, but that it's clear that he had some fame and notoriety, or at least known in the marketplace, right? So to be able to do that and almost bring his personality to a team, perhaps out of whole cloth.
Yeah, and actually there's a really interesting recent development in the Players League. And by recent, I mean within the last few months. Someone discovered a treasure trove of documents related to the Players League. This was just announced, I think, in October or November of 2017. Somebody was cleaning out an old house in upstate New York, and they found a whole box of contracts, letters, documents related to the Players League, and then they just auctioned them off about a month ago. One of those documents was a lease for what was called Brotherhood Park in New York, which actually became what is known as the Polo Grounds, where Willie Mays played and Giants played for many decades. And on that lease, Ward signed his signature. And so what this tells us is that Ward initially intended to play and be a partial owner of the New York 1890 Players League team. But presumably because the Brooklyn Players League team didn't have the star talent, the celebrity that some of the other teams did, Ward agreed to play for Brooklyn, kind of at the last minute. So yeah, Ward was supposed to continue playing with his New York teammates in 1890, but he moved to Brooklyn really to kind of anchor that team and give them a recognized superstar, because most of the other players on Brooklyn that year were good, but they were not famous all-stars or superstars like Ward was.
Yeah, that's fascinating on a number of different levels. And by the way, Ward maybe perhaps was interesting because the Brooklyn Ward's Wonders had actually were finished in second, just ahead of the New York Giants in the final tally of the when it came to the standings. So it kind of shows you. You wonder if Ward had been part of the Giants, if they perhaps could have been in first and knocked out the Boston Reds in that process. But that's neither here nor there. I am really interested, though, in how the league did. I mean, it seems like that the play on the field was pretty darn good. I saw in a footnote somewhere that there was a period of time, a couple of weeks there were actually 7 triple plays.
Yeah.
It seems like there was some really good play, but and they did well at the gate as well, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, by all accounts, they outdrew the National League in attendance by perhaps a margin of 2-1. It was funny, as the first and maybe only time in baseball history, every day in the newspapers or every week in the newspapers, they had next to the standings of the Players League or the National League, they had the attendance standings. In other words, which league and which teams were getting the most fans, and people were paying attention to that as much as they were the wins and losses. And by all accounts, the Players League drew so many more fans than the National League, because the National League was dealing with a bunch of unknown players by and large. They had to recruit players from the lesser, what we would call today the minor league teams, to fill out a roster sometimes. So the Players League had a better product on the field. They had newer ballparks, which by all accounts were also more comfortable, better looking, more stylish, and certainly newer. And the play, was great. They had lots of exciting games. There were great defensive plays, which was, I think, kind of a bigger deal then than it is now. Now, we're impressed by home runs and maybe, 98 mile per hour fastballs. Then defense was really celebrated. And that was part of Ward's popularity, is that he was a terrific shortstop, as well as, he was a pitcher initially and then turned into a shortstop. And there was great base running, which was also a very important part of the game. Home runs weren't that important. And in fact, one of the interesting things that I learned while doing this research is, particularly when I was reading newspaper accounts about the new ballparks that the Players League created, one of the selling points that the reporters would mention about a lot of the ballparks is they'd say things like, the outfield is so big, they're certainly not to lose any balls from home runs. In other words, like, come see baseball here because you won't see home runs, which, home runs were not as, they certainly weren't as common, and they weren't, it wasn't what people came to see. They came to see defense and good base running, clever play. And by all accounts, the Players League had that. And this was despite a shaky beginning of the season in terms of weather. It was unseasonably cold through much of the Northeast in 1890. It rained a lot. So that depressed attendance figures a little bit, presumably. And, it just made the play a little bit weaker across baseball, whatever league you're a part of, just because the fields would be muddy and the players were cold. But about around June or the end of May, the weather got a lot warmer, and once they were in the clear in terms of the weather, the Players League ballparks filled up, and the National League ballparks were sometimes near empty. Like Pittsburgh played a game. They're debating accounts of this. Some people have said that there were as few as 18 people at this one game. I could only find a record of as little as 150 people, but in any case, the National League was losing lots of money, and certainly more than the Players League was.
So given the positive vibes and play and attendances and the players, the quality players in the Players League, given that that was going on, Why did it not succeed past 1890 season?
It's a great question. And lots of people have had different hypotheses about this. What I concluded just through the evidence that I found in the newspapers and the records of some of the teams is that simply the investors who backed the Players League clubs were impatient. To put it simply, they wanted to make money right away. And all the teams except for Boston did not make a profit the first year, mostly because they had to shell out a lot of money to build the ballparks in the first place. If you took out the costs of building the ballparks, the Boston team at least would have made a profit somewhere near, I think, about $40,000, which at that time would have been one of the most profitable baseball teams, single season baseball teams in baseball history at the time. But all of the teams had to deal with this big initial cost, and the investors wanted to make money right away. And so they dropped their purported ideological allegiance to the players' cause and said to the National League owners, how about we just combine our teams? So why have a New York National League team and a New York Players League team? Why don't we just have one? And just one by one, each of the Players League clubs investors just kind of dropped out and combined with the National League forces. And they did this largely behind the backs of the players. I mean, it was a really big betrayal of the players by the owners. Also, there were a couple players who were operating as spies. Buck Ewing was one of the Players League players who all along had been secretly feeding information to the National League, telling them, the financial records and that sort of thing. But it really,
you're saying there was espionage then. There were moles, if you will, within the Players League, huh?
Yeah. There were, secret backroom meetings. There's this story about Buck Ewing being led up all the way up to Upper Manhattan and then into the Bronx to this secret kind of clubhouse back of a saloon full of cigar smoke where he met with the owners to secretly share this information. So yeah, and the players never forgave him for that. That was something that they really never forgave him for it. But yeah, it was a surprise to the players because by the end of the 1890 season, they knew that they had the better, more attractive product on the field. The Players League, after the season ended, purchased a few of the people involved in the Players League purchased the Cincinnati club from the National League, which was one of the most profitable clubs in the National League. So they saw this as a big coup. Everything was in place for the Players League to go forward, and in their eyes, perhaps they could have put the National League out of business. But the Players League investors didn't want to continue to battle with the National League. They didn't want to continue to compete with them. They wanted to get their money back more quickly. So many of them just sold out to the National League. Others just combined forces. And by January of 1891, the Players League had folded, which came as a surprise to a lot of people and a source of deep anger and sadness for the players, especially John Ward. I mean, John Ward was just absolutely devastated that this project that he had put so much of his life into had just collapsed almost all of a sudden.
Do you sense that some of the backers of the Players League, the financial backers, some or all of them or a couple of them, had foresight that they ultimately would benefit somehow, even if this league sort of didn't go much further than a couple of seasons, that they ultimately would be made whole and then some by somehow forcing a sale or a merger or something with the National League, almost to the point maybe where maybe even some of the National League owners helped prop up some of those things? Or am I just putting its conspiracy theory in the mix?
No, that's a good question. I mean, there's certainly some of the Players League backers said later that, they had visions of millions of dollars when they started out. How they were going to get those millions of dollars, they didn't exactly detail, but that's quite possible. I mean, I think above everything else, like, they were businessmen, they were investors, they were looking to make money. And even though in the 1890 offseason, they publicized their participation in the Players League as if it were kind of this noble charitable cause, like, I believe in the players' struggle and they deserve this, and et cetera, et cetera. It was a business endeavor for them. And I mean, you could argue that to the extent that the National League was a relatively exclusive club of baseball owners, maybe some of the Players League owners felt like, this maybe could be my way into that club by first getting involved in the Players League and then getting into the National League that way. I think that's a reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah, and I think that's the only reason I throw that out is just informed by some of the conversations that we've had over the many months of, we're talking about things even more recent, but challenger leagues, whether it be the AFL in football or the USFL in football or the WHA in hockey or the ABA certainly in basketball, right? These are, it's one thing to challenge and disrupt sort of the status quo, open up markets, but it's also sort of, as we see a theme for certain members behind the scenes, that there's sort of this this thinking that in some way, shape, or form, if we're successful for at least a period of time, that we'll be able to sort of get ourselves into this exclusive club and profit and succeed and win in the process. So it almost feels like a rudimentary on some levels beginnings or early version of that in 1890, 1891.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. And regardless of the intentions of the owners, the Players League owners, it at least set an example that this apparent monopoly, that is the National League, could be challenged and could be successfully challenged. And so I think actually, even though the initial legacy of the Players League was that the National League returned to power even stronger than before, and the American Association went out of business very soon after the Players League folded. And the National League had really sole supremacy over baseball for a time. It wasn't that long later, about a decade later, that the American League was formed. And I think what the Players League demonstrated is that there was room for a league like the American League. There were opportunities for at least, if not long-term, short-term gain for people who might compete with the National League. And of course, the Federal League, about 15 years after the American League, emerges as a rival league to the National League. And so, yeah, I think the Players League certainly was instructive in that regard for investors who wanted to make money, that you didn't have to, as you said, and as you're illustrating with your show and so many other different sports, you don't have to get into the big league, the major league, necessarily to start making money off of the sport.
All right. Well, as we round third base and head to home in our interview here, not to strain an analogy, but why don't maybe you can give us a little bit of your perspective as to the legacy, perhaps, of this league. It's clear, right, that not only in baseball but sports generally, this issue of the player as labor, so to speak, versus oftentimes different perspectives and or motivations of quote unquote management. These are issues that are about as modern and current as they were, oddly, back in the day. Have things gotten better or worse? Are there any sort of learnings and or things that can be taken from this very interesting chapter in baseball that are either, that are applicable today or perhaps being ignored? As they say, people who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. What is your takeaway vis-a-vis today's modern game? It seems to me like there are some issues that are just as relevant as they were back then.
I think so. I think there's a lot of relevance still today, and I think it stretches beyond sports. I mean, I wrote this in the first place in part motivated just by the idea that workers deserve to be paid for the value that they create, that workers need to struggle for that value. And that's true whether you're a carpenter or a baseball player or a professor or a radio broadcaster or whatever it might be. There's always going to be this struggle between the workers and the bosses, and who gains control of the revenue that the workers create. So I think it's eternally relevant in that sense, as long as we have that economic system in place. But I think in relation to sports, to me, the most relevant cases are minor league baseball right now, where you have players making barely minimum wage. Sometimes you could argue less than minimum wage, where they're not unionized. They have very few rights. They are in very precarious positions, aside from the guys who sign for these huge signing bonuses, and maybe some guys in AAA who are on the 40-man roster. But a single A player just out of college has to live with a family, has to have a meal allowance just to be able to afford to eat. So I think there's certainly some relevance just to the labor situation there. And also, to be fair, the Players League did not really care about, or at least did not express any care about, the lesser leagues of their day or the minor league players. So it's not like Ward and his compatriots were champions for all baseball players or champions for all common workers by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that the second case where it's really relevant is in college sports, where you have debates around whether these college athletes, particularly in basketball and football, should be paid for the work that they do. They are certainly creating millions and millions of dollars for TV networks, for these universities. And of course, the universities aren't allowed to buy them a hamburger lest they be sanctioned by the NCAA. Of course, they're given tuition scholarships and living expenses and that sort of thing. But I think that struggle and those debates over athletes and the money they generate versus the money that they're paid, I think that NCAA struggle right now is quite parallel to the Players League struggle. Of course, there's lots of differences. It's a completely different time and different structures and different sports. But I'm hoping, that this book will, if it does nothing else, hopefully it'll entertain some people and inform people, but I hope it also helps people to think differently about how workers, entertainers, athletes are compensated for the work they do versus the revenue that their labor generates.
Well, this conversation has informed and entertained me immensely. Here's your chance to promote it. So why don't you, in your own words, give us the title, the publisher, and where it's available and all that kind of good stuff.
Sure. It's called The Great Baseball Revolt, The Rise and Fall of the 1890 Players League. It was published by the University of Nebraska Press. You can purchase it on Amazon. You can purchase it directly from the University of Nebraska Press's website. probably Barnes and Nobles and anywhere else where books are sold. It's a relatively quick and easy read. It's about 200 and something pages. I loved writing it. I'll shamelessly say that I also love rereading it. I was just, before we talked, I was rereading parts of it. I think it's will be an entertaining read, informative read for people who are interested in baseball history or labor history or the combination of the two, or who are interested in just 19th century American life. There's some drama, there's some action, there's a little bit of color and a little bit of economics as well, and even some geography. So yeah, I really loved it, and I hope your listeners might enjoy it as well.
And again, friends in Hollywood, if you're listening and you're looking for, frankly, something more original than reheating a 1970s sitcom or something and trying to make a movie franchise out of it. This is, I think this is a story, at least as factually told, that probably has some creative license hooks for sure. If you think about like the 1889, prelude to the 1890 Players League season and stuff, you wonder and can imagine some of the great storytelling and or drama that, or frankly, even comedy, I guess, that could be brought to bear on that. So I'm sure Professor Ross would be very excited to talk to you about the rights to that story and tell you in much more detail. And we highly encourage it. And you know what? I'll tell you this, Bob. I'm amazed at who listens to this. And as we sort of grow incrementally each week, we haven't really done a whole lot of publicity, and maybe we'll start ramping that up in the months to come. But I'm just amazed at how this permeates various sort of nooks and crannies of the world. I look at the world map and some of the countries that have listened to this silly little show, which is pretty amazing to me. But literally, I do get inquiries and questions and queries about certain topics, or we stumble across something, and I got to think that there's going to be somebody out there at some point over time who might be more interested. And I hope maybe this conversation has piqued that interest, or maybe introduced it for the first time. And you never know. So hopefully it'll live on, and maybe some further and good things will come from it. And just remember that I will always get 10%. Just kidding. But Bob, thank you. This has been awesome. I've learned a tremendous amount. This has been a hugely educational, but also fun journey. I appreciate your taking time to walk me and our listeners through it.
Oh, you're welcome. And I really appreciate you and the show that you've created and for inviting me onto it. It's been a true pleasure and honor to talk with you.
All right, there it is. More interestingness from the world of baseball. And it's not necessarily the sport that I've been the most passionate about, I guess, in this sort of exploration. And Lord knows when you go back in sort of the older times, especially the 1800s, I mean, it gets a little dusty and musty and it is historical. But I must tell you that I'm probably most enlightened by these conversations. Yes, I love talking to former players of the 70s and the 80s and the 60s and the 90s and administrators and owners and sportscasters and all that kind of stuff. We got a bunch of those coming up. But I'll tell you, going back into these history vaults, it seems like it would be somewhat dry and uninteresting, but it is the exact opposite. And again, the more, we sort of investigate these stories and find out more about them, about leagues and teams no longer in existence, we find, as we said at the top of the show, that these stories, these themes, keep coming back, and they're morphing into sort of different versions of things, right? But the idea between players and owners and the strife, the various flavors of strife between them, these are not new principles, friends. And there's a player's a strike or a lockout or a collective bargaining agreement. These things keep coming back over and over again, and this sort of the tension between, ownership and the workers, shall we say, is something that's is as old as labor itself, beyond sports, but certainly in sports. And look, the whole Players League of 1890, was probably the first visceral example of what would be a long litany of events, dramatic ones at that, between sort of the ownership of professional sports franchises and the leagues that they play in, and the players that ostensibly are the talent that people pay to watch and enjoy at the highest level. So, in history are lessons, and lessons are certainly well worth remembering when we all think that we, in our day-to-day lives, that we're always struggling or stumbling into something new. The reality is that things just seem to be newer versions of old problems. Quick trivia note here, the only champion of the Players League, I don't know if we mentioned it in our chat, I forgot, frankly, was this is a good trivia question for your next cocktail party, when people are just going to be phenomenally intrigued with your knowledge of the Players League. Was the Boston Reds. Yes, the Boston Reds were the one and only champions of the Players League. So there you go. Have an extra drink on me at your next cocktail party when you win the trivia contest with that one. All right, let's remind you again that the book is called The Great Baseball Revolt. It is written by our friend Bob Ross. It is subtitled The Rise and Fall of the 1890 Players League. It is on the imprint of our friends at the University of Nebraska Press, who we seem to be relying on a lot lately. And boy, oh boy, what a treasure trove of titles that they've had. We've got a few more of their authors coming up, and we are promised a whole bunch of new titles coming up later on this year. So our new friends at the University of Nebraska Press, we love helping promote some of their books and their authors, and they've been all great conversations, and we thank our friend Rosemary Sikora and her team for all of their efforts in that. You can buy that book, of course, wherever fine books are found, but we, of course, encourage you to go to our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up the episode number 57 with Bob Ross, and you'll see a whole bunch of links there. You'll see some great pictures and some imagery and some little synopsis of the show, but also, importantly, you'll find a couple of links to the book. And of course, if you click on that link, go through Amazon, we'll go get a few shekels for your doing so. So that's always a good place, by the way, if you want to check out a book or a CD or a DVD or some other form of media that we mention or promote here on the show. Make sure to go to goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up that episode that said product or item was mentioned on, and likely we'll have a link there, and that's always a good way to help support the show. We always encourage you, of course, to check out our social media feeds in addition to our website. Twitter, that's at GoodSeatsStill. You'll find us on Instagram at GoodSeatsStillAvailable. On Facebook, yes, there's a page devoted to us there. We have not deleted Facebook yet, although we certainly are tempted sometimes. But for now, we have a page there. So look up Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us there. And last but not least, thank you to our friends at Podfly Productions, podfly.net, and of course, the good, the one, the only good doctor, Jerry Payne, who painstakingly, to stretch a word there, does a tremendous job in helping put this little show together. We thank you, Jerry, as well as his colleagues, Eric McGay and Corey Coates and David Gregerson. Podfly Productions, check them out. If you want a podcast, the place to do it is Podfly Productions, and you'll find them at podfly.net. All right, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. Great stuff coming up later in the weeks to come. Stay tuned. Make sure your feed is set to us, and tell your friends to subscribe as well. We appreciate it. We'll see you soon next week, hopefully. Take care, everybody.